So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the different pieces of hardware. The first thing you're going to notice is over here, there's the typical snap swivel and barrel swivel. Now for these two elements, you can get these on Amazon or Temu or your local store in bulk. So for example, these I got off of Amazon. You get like 200 pieces, different sizes, and it'll cost you about $8 for just these. And then the same thing for this. You can get 50 or 100 pieces for under $10. And while these work for fishing generally for bass, smallmouth, or pretty much any other kind of fishing that you would typically do, and they work perfectly fine. They're rated for a specific weights, and you can get by with them. But you'll find here, after we have a discussion about why you don't want to use these, you'll begin to understand that the mechanics of what they represent are not conducive to trolling on a lake for larger fish. So the second part of this is, well, what should you buy? And these elements of your leader system are what you want to look to buy. You'll notice that they look slightly different. This is more of a snap with no swivel on it. This is a barrel swivel, but it's a little bit beefier looking. And this here is a snap, but with this kind of swivel on the bottom. Now, what are the difference with these? You can get these also on Amazon. The difference is you're going to get about 25 of these for the same price that you're going to get 100 of these. And the same thing for the barrel swivels and the same thing for the snap swivels. You're going to get a far lesser quantity for roughly the same price. Now, what does that mean? That means that the quality of these items are significantly enhanced. Now, why does quality matter? Well, let's get into some of the physics of how this works. When you're fishing normally using this type of hardware, you're probably going to be okay. But when you're trolling, let's take this for example. The mechanics of this swivel, your leader coming out this way is going to be moving constantly in a similar motion. It's either going to be going side to side, right? Or back and forth. But the bottom line is this swivel part is going to be moving, all right? And it's going to be moving in a very rapid motion down into the water column for potentially hours and hours on end. And if you're buying the cheap stuff, as an example, the inside part of this and the metal will just wear out. It's hard to see on the camera, but right here, there's a seam on this particular swivel. And you can tell that it's not very, I will say, good quality. It's thinner compared to when you look at something like this. All right, this is a much more solid construction whenever it has a very different feel to it. And you can just tell by holding it in your hand that it's going to hold up better under the stresses of use, that this type of swivel will not. Now, what has happened to me out on the lake is that using either of these, I've lost gear because they've literally failed. Whenever I'm disconnecting the walleye from the lure, I've had the barrel swivels and these kinds of swivels break off in my hand because the metal has worn out inside of the barrel and the swivel when you're buying these things on the cheap. So when you're building your leader, I guess the general consensus is buy the better stuff. You may have this stuff lying around, but once you get your entire system together, you're going to be invested about $35, $40, and you don't want to lose it by not spending a couple dollars on the better stuff. Let's talk about the snap. At the bottom of your leader, this is what connects to your lures. So whether it's a spoon, a stick bait, or something else, this is what you're going to connect to it. Now, for this particular leader, this is a number 2. And you'll notice it's a little bit smaller than you would typically go with. Now, the reason for that is if you're running spoons, you want to make sure that it's fairly small. All right? And if you're running your stick baits off of this, you also want it to be relatively small. The larger snaps, which you can get, typically number 4s, you can use them, but when you want to use the number 4s, you would connect them to other things, like to your main line, to other elements of a system. When you're talking about connecting to your lures, you want to be using a number 2 snap. What we need to talk about first before we get started is why are we using a snap like this instead of this, a snap swivel, at the beginning of the leader where it attaches to the lure. Now, when we're fishing with walleye, you're using spoons, worm harnesses, stick baits like bandits or P10s. And if you're using this snap swivel, your lures, instead of having a back and forth motion, specifically with spoons, depending on the water and your speed and everything, they can get into a spin. All right. So you want to use this type of snap when it attaches to your lure to help control the motion of the lure as you're trolling through the water. Now, having this at the lure and this on the other end, you're still going to get some spin, and it will help your line from getting all twisted and tangled if you have this further up on the leader towards the Dipsey Diver. But if you have this down at the lure level, you're going to get a lot more spin, or potentially get a lot more of that spin and unexpected behavior of your lure by having the swivel look more like this, or having a barrel swivel with a snap swivel down below. Now, I know folks online in the videos that you watch will tell you, this doesn't really matter. Try it out in the water alongside your boat when you have some pretty clear conditions. You can definitely see different behavior with this versus this versus this, and how they work together. So if you had something that looked like that, you're probably going to do pretty good. If you have something like this, you're going to get a certain behavior. If you have something that looks like this, you're going to get a different behavior. And if you don't want to take my word for it, like I said, just try it in the water and see what you get. I've noticed a distinct difference between the combinations of these two setups, depending on what type of swivel that you want to put at the other end of the leader versus not having one at the beginning of the leader where it attaches to your lure. Well, here's an example of a leader that I tied up, and you'll notice there's my number 2, and it's tied on. And on this particular one, it's 6 feet in length, right? And on the other end, we have the snap swivel that I mentioned earlier, all right? This is also a number 2, all right? Now, you want to try to keep things consistent, right, when you're tying these. And that's the basic setup of our system. So on this end, you have your number 2, just the snap, like this. And on this end, you have the snap swivel and 6 feet of leader. So let's get started with this. The first thing we're going to do is connect the snap to one end of the leader. I've measured 6 feet of this leader out. This is 20-pound fluorocarbon, and I'll include a link in the description below that you can get this. But it's 20-pound fluorocarbon, and we're going to tie onto this what's called a Palomar knot. Now, I know a lot of people will tie, the standard improved clinch or the fisherman's knot where you just put it around, wrap it, put it through. But you'll notice that there's only one strand of line with that particular knot connecting the snap. I like to use the Palomar knot because it gives you a double piece of line. So the way you tie that on this particular one is you put it through a loop like this. All right, put the loop through. All right, then you bring it back on itself like so. All right, just like that. Put the loop through the circle you just made. All right, and then you take your snap, you put it down over, and then you pull it all tight. All right, now, see how that is like looped up there? All right, you want to make sure that you wet it, and before you tie it all tight, you want to make sure that you pull everything nice and tight. Now, one thing that happens a lot is you see this little hook right here. Sometimes that loop will get stuck on there and you have to make sure that you get it all nice and neat up here on the top. And then all you do is take your tag in, cut it off. All right. So again, Palomar knot, attach everything. And then once you get it there, you just pull that sucker down tight and you're ready to go. All right, so the next side is the snap swivel. And so the same type of knot, make a loop in your line, just like that. Put it through the bottom, loop it around. Just like before, put it through there. And then I usually take this and put it back up through. It's just easier to control it. And then you tighten everything down. Now you see how that kind of got stuck on there a little bit? Just like that. You want to make sure that that comes all the way up here when you start pulling everything tight. Make it nice and wet. Pull it tight. All right? Take off the tag end. And there you go. All right, so now we have a new leader with 2 ends, just like this. One for the snap only, and one for the snap swivel, just like that. They're both pied on with a Palomar knot to a 6-foot, 20-pound test fluorocarbon leader. And that in its simplest form is how you tie a leader that we're going to use for a Dipsey Diver. All right, a couple parting comments on this leader setup. The first thing is, why do I use a number 2 here instead of a number 4? I know a lot of videos talk about using a number 4 on this size, but why do I use a number 2? Well, the main reason is because I can connect this end to my snubber for a Dipsey Diver, and then I can put a spoon on this directly. Now, if I want to take off the Dipsey Diver and I want to run a Bandit or some other type of stick bait, I just connect this snap swivel here to my main line, and then I can connect this number 2 directly to that Bandit or stick bait or P10 or whatever you want to do. I don't have to have separate leaders for Dipsey Diver setups and board setups. So this allows me to tie up a whole bunch of these types of leaders, and I can use them interchangeably throughout the day. So for example, let's say that I'm not catching anything on a Dipsey Diver. Well, I can disconnect this leader and the Dipsey Diver from my main line, hook this back up to my main line, and now I can put a P10 on here and run a board out, all using the same leader setup. And I don't have to retie anything, and I don't have to have a lot of leader setups on my boat. All right, so let's talk about this leader setup again. We tied this leader setup at 6 feet. What I typically do is I tie exactly the same setup, but I do another one at 4 feet. So I have a 4-foot setup with this type of leader configuration, and I have a 6-foot setup with this leader configuration. Now the 6-foot I typically use for spoons, and I use them for stick baits. All right, with boards and Dipsey Divers and that sort of thing. The 4-foot version I use if I'm using, let's say, worm harnesses, right? So on a Dipsey Diver setup, I may use a worm harness. So what I'll do is I'll disconnect my 6-foot leader, I'll tie on a 4-foot leader, and then on this end, right here, the snap, I connect my 2-foot, typically 18 inches to 2-foot worm harness leader, and that combined gives me a 6-foot leader. So that way, again, you're tying up a bunch of these in either a 4-foot configuration or a 6-foot configuration that you can use interchangeably with worm harnesses, Dipsey Diver setups, and board setups. And if you're like me, where I'm fishing by myself typically, not having to retie or reconfigure a lot helps me keep my lines in the water a lot longer. And it also means that I don't have to carry more configurations of leaders, snap configurations, swivel configurations on my boat for the various fishing techniques that I might have to do throughout the day. Let's talk about this side of the Dipsey Diver. So we're not going to get into the lever settings or the backside of the Dipsey on this video. We're going to have another one that we talk about that because that deserves its own video. But to attach this swivel here, you typically would have again, a number 2 snap swivel. Looks just like this on your main line, and you would attach that to here. And that concludes how you would do from end to end, how to set up your Dipsey Diver.